Maria Santiago had never worn a uniform, but every soldier at Fort Bragg knew her name. She was the one who made the eggs fluffy, who remembered lactose allergies without needing reminders, and who served the kind of chili that even the toughest drill sergeants called home. To most, she was just Miss Maria, the civilian cook with the fast hands and warm eyes. But on one otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, Maria's world would change forever, not because of what she served, but because of what she heard. It started like any other day. Maria had been up since 4 a.m., flipping pancakes and brewing coffee by the gallon. The sun had barely kissed the Carolina pines when soldiers began lining up outside the mess hall. She greeted them by name as they passed through. Private Langley, Sergeant Morales, Captain Rickers. She knew them all. She knew who was quiet before a deployment, who was missing a loved one, and who just needed an extra slice of bacon to face the day. She never asked for anything in return. But today, something felt different. While replenishing the coffee at the officer's table, where the brass usually huddled in murmurs and coffee steam, Maria's ears caught a few sharp phrases that made her hands freeze mid-pour. "We're rerouting the aid. I'm not sacrificing the Georgia facility's deadline for some muddy mountain town," General Rourke said, his voice flat and certain. "They'll recover eventually. That town always does." Maria's stomach turned. She didn't mean to listen, but her instincts sharpened. They were talking about the Appalachian relief trucks. She knew them well. The base had approved aid after a historic flood had decimated homes in several mountain towns. One of those towns, Hollow Creek, was where her cousin Teresa lived, with 3 children in a trailer that now sat in 6 inches of mud. Maria had seen the photos. She had cried looking at the broken toys, the collapsed roof, and the empty pantry. And now, that aid, food, blankets, medicine, was being diverted. Quietly, just like that. Redirecting, it's the smart move, Rourke added. No one will raise questions. Maria turned away, clutching the coffee pot like it was the only thing keeping her steady. She returned to the kitchen, where the fryer sizzled and the fan hummed, but she couldn't hear anything. Her ears rang with anger. Her hands, normally so sure and swift, trembled as she sliced onions. She had never interfered, never questioned the chain of command. She had been hired to feed, not to fight. But how could she serve these men, knowing what they had just decided? All morning, she wore a mask of normalcy. She smiled at the young corporal, who liked extra syrup, joked with the chaplain who hated toast crusts, and handed an extra fruit cup to the homesick rookie. But her mind churned. Could she say something? Who would even care? She was just the cook. And yet, when her shift ended that afternoon, Maria didn't go straight home. She stopped at the base library. It was quiet, sterile, and half-lit. She sat at one of the outdated desktop computers and opened a blank email. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her heart pounded. She thought of Teresa, of the soaked mattress her nieces had to sleep on, of the other mothers in Hollow Creek. Trying to explain to their children why help hadn't come. She started typing in clear, careful words. Maria described what she heard. She explained the rerouting of aid, how it was being done behind closed doors, and how wrong it felt. She didn't name herself, but she didn't lie either. She addressed it not to the base commander, but to someone higher, Major General Claiborne, known for his integrity and reputation for accountability. She finished the email, read it 3 times, then clicked send. That night, Maria cooked dinner. In silence. Her radio played soft jazz in the background, but she barely heard it. She kept checking the clock. Would anyone respond? Would it even matter? Days passed. Then weeks. She continued her job. Woke up early, served with a smile. Said nothing. Until one afternoon, while pouring iced tea behind the counter, A young MP she barely knew slid a sealed envelope across the stainless steel. No words. Just a nod. The envelope was marked confidential. Maria held it in her hands and felt the weight of something she couldn't quite name. Something had shifted, and there would be no going back. Asterisk. The envelope sat untouched on Maria's kitchen table all night. She'd placed it there after slipping it under her sweater, heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. It was still sealed, its corners sharp against the wood grain. The label, confidential, stared back like a warning. But Maria knew it wasn't just paperwork. It was validation. Proof someone had read her message. Proof someone knew. She didn't open it until dawn. Inside was a brief letter, typed and stamped. We have received credible information and are reviewing internal logistics related to humanitarian rerouting. Please maintain discretion. You may be contacted. It was signed by an assistant in the office of Major General Claiborne. Maria read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it away in her pantry behind the sugar bag. Not out of cowardice, but protection. What she'd done wasn't exactly against the law, but it wasn't routine either. And now she was being watched. She could feel it. When she arrived at the base that morning, the air felt heavier. A mess hall, usually buzzing with banter and trays clattering, was unusually quiet. Or maybe she was just noticing it differently. She returned to the kitchen and resumed her duties, but her senses were sharper now. Every voice seemed a little louder. Every glance lingered too long. Then came the questions. First, it was subtle. The supply sergeant asked if she'd been anywhere near the officer's wing last week. A junior officer in logistics struck up a strange conversation about people who talk too much. And the kitchen supervisor casually mentioned that General Rourke was cleaning house. Maria kept her head down and stirred the oatmeal, trying not to show the storm inside her. At lunchtime, two men in pressed uniforms entered the kitchen unannounced. They weren't MPs, at least not in uniform, but they asked to see her locker. No reason given, no warrant shown. Just polite force. She let them. They rifled through her things, found nothing but a scarf, a prayer card, and a spare apron. They thanked her and left. But the message was clear. Someone knew. Still, Maria kept serving. A few soldiers, ones she'd known for years, started giving her small, quiet signs of support. A sticky note left near the dish station read, "They don't scare us. Keep going." Another soldier, a soft-spoken sergeant, started walking her to the parking lot at night without being asked. He never said why. He didn't have to. That evening, Maria sat alone on her porch, watching the moths gather around the porch light. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her tea. She thought about Hollow Creek. Teresa had texted her a photo that morning. The local school gym, meant to be a temporary shelter, had run out of supplies. Children were sleeping on cardboard pallets. One boy had pneumonia. The medical van was still delayed. Delayed because of men like Rourke. Maria's jaw tightened. She might have been just the cook, but she had never felt more responsible for something in her life. She hadn't joined the military, but she believed in its core mission: protect and serve. That didn't mean just soldiers. It meant people. Civilians, families, towns. And right now, that mission was being betrayed by greed. The next morning, she decided to act again. Not recklessly, but with purpose. She used her break to visit a soldier she trusted, Captain Leah Monroe, a logistics officer known for her straight spine and sharper morals. Maria had seen her confront a colonel once over expired rations. If anyone would help, it would be Monroe. "Can I speak to you privately?" Maria asked. Captain Monroe raised an eyebrow, but nodded. In the empty dining office, Maria spoke. Quietly, carefully, she told Monroe everything. The conversation she overheard, the letter, the envelope, the search, the harassment. She handed her a copy of the letter she'd printed that morning before work. Monroe didn't speak for a moment. Then she looked Maria dead in the eyes and said, "You just became the most dangerous person on this base." Maria's breath caught. "I'm not trying to be dangerous." Monroe leaned forward. "No, but you are, because you care. And that scares them more than you know." Outside, a storm was building. The sky had turned gray, and the wind began to whip through the parking lot like warning breath. Maria stood in that moment, somewhere between fear and courage, and understood. This was no longer just about aid shipments, Dot. It was about standing up when no one else would. It didn't take long for word to spread, Dot. By the end of the week, the base was humming with tension. Conversations that once floated freely in the mess hall now came in hushed fragments. Officers grew wary. Junior soldiers kept their heads down. A few glanced nervously toward the kitchen, where Maria Santiago moved with steady purpose, flipping grilled cheese, refilling salad trays, smiling like nothing had changed. But everything had. Behind closed doors, General Rourke was furious. Someone had leaked internal orders. Someone had questioned his authority. He had ruled Fort Bragg with quiet confidence for years. No one dared challenge his decisions. Not his officers, not the contractors, and certainly not the cook. Now, his power felt cracked. Maria sensed the shift in the air. Eyes followed her more closely. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Some staff avoided her altogether. Others offered quick, sympathetic nods in passing. Nothing spoken, but everything understood. She wasn't naive. She had stirred a hornet's nest. One morning, her usual entrance through the back kitchen was blocked. A stern-faced base official stood waiting. Routine security check, he claimed, leading her to an administrative office. There, she was met by two officers in suits. They requested access to her phone, citing unconfirmed leaks. When she refused, they left her waiting for 2 hours before allowing her to return to work. The next day, her locker had been emptied. No warning. Her apron, prayer card, and lunch were gone. Still, Maria showed up. Still, she served. But under the surface, the pressure was rising. Meanwhile, Captain Monroe had taken her concerns seriously. She had filed an internal inquiry, quietly requesting a follow-up from command regarding the aid rerouting. Her channels were discreet, but Maria knew Monroe was risking her own position. That meant something, not just for Maria, but for the truth. Then came a knock at Maria's door, late one evening. It was Sergeant Danny Knox, a combat medic she had once comforted when he returned from his second tour overseas. His face was pale, and his voice shook as he spoke. "I think you should hear something," he said, holding up his phone. It was a recording. Maria listened in stunned silence. It was audio, crackly but clear, of General Rourke, inside his office, speaking with two subordinates. "If this woman keeps pushing, I'll have her reassigned, shut her out, blacklist her if I have to. I don't care if she's feeding my whole damn battalion. She doesn't get to play hero." Then came laughter. Chilling, callous laughter. Maria felt her stomach twist. She didn't ask how Sergeant Knox got the recording. She only asked, "Will you let me share it?" He nodded. "Someone has to." The next day, Maria forwarded the audio to Major General Claiborne's office with a single line attached. "If you need evidence, here it is." That night, everything changed. The audio was leaked to the press. Within hours. It spread like wildfire across military forums, activist circles, and news outlets. Leaked audio exposes general's retaliation against civilian whistleblower. That was the headline splashed across evening broadcasts. Maria's name wasn't used, not yet, but those on base knew. Everyone knew. The following morning, Maria entered the kitchen to find complete silence. Every soldier, every staff member, every cleaner turned to look at her. No one spoke. Then a young private stepped forward and without a word saluted her. One by one, others followed. Maria stood frozen in place, overwhelmed. She hadn't asked for this. She had no stars, no ribbons. Just a hairnet, a spatula, and a heart that refused to stay silent. Later that day, she was called to the base commander's office, not Rourke's, but the deputy's. A temporary reassignment. A protective measure. She was placed on leave, with full pay, until the investigation unfolded. That night, Maria sat on her porch again, watching the storm clouds gather for real this time. Thunder rolled low in the distance. She wasn't sure if she felt safe or more vulnerable than ever. She hadn't wanted to be a symbol. She had just wanted to do the right thing. But now, with truth finally out and the public beginning to stir, she realized something. This wasn't just about a rerouted shipment anymore. This was a battle for integrity, not in a war zone, but in the heart of the system that was supposed to serve and protect. And Maria Santiago, the cook no one expected, had just become its fiercest soldier. Maria was called in for a final conversation. Before her suspension officially began, the request came quietly through official channels. No threat, no force. But everyone understood what it meant. The base wasn't going to fire her. That would spark more outrage. Instead, they'd isolate her, muzzle her, and wait for the story to fade. But Maria wasn't fading. She arrived in a plain blouse and jeans. No apron, no hairnet. Her ID badge was clipped neatly to her chest. As she entered the administration wing, silence followed her like a shadow. A young assistant led her down the hallway, past photos of decorated generals and dusty awards, to a room at the end. Inside, at a wide conference table, sat General Rourke. He didn't stand. "Miss Santiago," he said coolly, "take a seat." Maria didn't move. She stood across from him, arms crossed gently, watching him like she'd watched boiling pots. All her life, waiting for pressure to break the surface. Rourke exhaled. "I know what you think you're doing. And I'm going to say this once. This path doesn't end well for you." Maria tilted her head. "No, General. It doesn't end well for you." He narrowed his eyes. "You're not military. You don't understand the weight of command. The needs of a national force outweigh the sob stories of flood victims. You don't get to lecture me on logistics." Maria's voice didn't rise. "I get to question what's in front of me. You wanted to leave children without medical supplies. For the sake of a construction deadline. That's not logistics. That's cruelty." For a moment, there was silence, the kind that sharpens every breath. "You leaked classified movement orders?" He snapped. "I reported unethical decisions," she replied. His face twitched. "You're going to disappear from this place. Miss Santiago, you'll never cook in a federal facility again. And believe me, that Medal of Freedom nonsense, it won't come. Your story will rot in the same backroom where you work." Then, a soft knock at the door. A base security officer entered, young, rigid, expressionless. But as he stepped inside, Maria saw it. The small audio recorder clipped subtly to his belt. His eyes flicked toward her, just once, and he stood, silent, beside the wall. Maria understood. It was happening again. Proof, witness, she took. A deep breath and leaned forward. "You think your stars protect you, but they don't. You may silence some people, but you won't silence the truth." Rourke chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Truth is what we shape, Miss Santiago. It's what we control." Maria shook her head. "Not anymore." She turned and walked out without permission. As the heavy doors closed behind her. She didn't know what was louder, the sound of her heartbeat or the crack in the general's power. Outside, Sergeant Knox was waiting near the base gate. He handed her a flash drive and whispered, "It's done." The full recording, every word from that meeting, had been captured. And it would be sent not to the media this time, but directly to the Senate Oversight Committee, already conducting a preliminary inquiry into the aid rerouting scandal. That night, Maria didn't go home. She drove 3 hours north to Hollow Creek, the town Rourke had deemed disposable. There, she met with volunteers distributing blankets and food to those still sleeping in broken homes. Her cousin Teresa hugged her tighter than she ever had before. "We saw you on the news," she whispered. "People here, they know what you did." But Maria shook her head. "No," she said softly. "You don't yet, but you will." The next morning, she woke to a flurry of calls and emails. The Senate committee had confirmed. General Rourke was being summoned for official questioning. His decisions, and now his recorded threats, had triggered a deeper investigation into abuse of power, whistleblower retaliation, and potential corruption in federal logistics. Maria's name was everywhere. Some headlines read, "Courage." In the kitchen, others simply said, "The cook who challenged a general." But she ignored the noise. She was already planning her next steps, not just to hold Rourke accountable, but to make sure it never happened again. She began speaking with attorneys and ethics advocates. A senator's office called her directly. Whistleblower protections were being reviewed. Maria Santiago hadn't just exposed injustice. She'd become the spark for a reckoning. And somewhere in the silence of the early morning, she realized something profound. She hadn't stepped out of line. She had stepped into her purpose. By the following week, Maria Santiago was no longer just a name whispered in mess halls or typed into emails. She was everywhere. Cable news showed clips of her walking out of the conference room. Online headlines exploded. Base cook leaks recording. General under fire. Whistleblower in apron brings down command giant. Courage comes from the kitchen. Maria watched it all unfold from the living room of her cousin Teresa's home in Hollow Creek. The town still smelled like mildew and heartbreak, but now the energy had shifted. Neighbors knocked just to thank her. Volunteers handed her boxes with trembling hands. Strangers offered to cook for her, as if returning a sacred favor. But along with support came the other side, the darkness. Phone calls flooded her cell. Some were from well-wishers, others from anonymous numbers. "She's a traitor. She betrayed the flag. She should be court-martialed, even if she's not in uniform." Emails came too, threats disguised as warnings, angry veterans claiming she had endangered national security. Maria didn't flinch, but she did start locking the doors. The Army issued an official statement. Investigations are underway. The Army respects all personnel, civilian or enlisted, and is committed to accountability at every level. It sounded noble, but Maria knew it was carefully crafted silence. Behind the scenes, things were far from quiet. Captain Monroe called her one night, whispering, "The Oversight Committee's moving fast. They're compiling evidence. Rourke's been grounded." "He hasn't left the base in days." Maria blinked. "He's still there. He's boxed in," Monroe said, "but not gone, not yet." That week, Maria was invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with Senate aides. She flew coach, wore the same shoes she cooked in, and sat quietly in a small room on Capitol Hill. They asked questions gently at first. Her background, what she heard, why she did it. "I didn't do it to make headlines," Maria said. "I did it because no one else would. And people were going to suffer." One of the aides, a young woman in uniform, looked her in the eye. "My grandparents live near Hollow Creek. You helped them without knowing." Maria didn't cry, not there. But her voice softened. "I just wanted them to be treated like people, not obstacles." Meanwhile, Fort Bragg was in lockdown. Audits were launched. Computers were seized. Dozens of officers were interviewed. 2 lower-ranked officers were reassigned after being linked to forged documents related to the rerouting dot, but the biggest blow came from the media. One evening, a prime-time news anchor played the full audio clip of General Rourke threatening Maria. "You'll disappear from this place. Your story will rot in the same backroom where you work." The clip went viral. The sound of his arrogance, cold, condescending, chilled audiences. A veteran-turned-commentator said, "This isn't about disrespecting rank. It's about someone in power failing to uphold the values the rank stands for." Maria began receiving interview requests from every major network. She declined most, agreeing to only one, a quiet sit-down on PBS, where she explained her story in her own words. Calm, unshaken, truthful. "You stood up to a general," the reporter said. "Where did that courage come from?" Maria paused, then answered, "It didn't feel like courage. It felt like cooking with a broken stove. You just find a way. Because the people waiting on that food are depending on you." Back in Hollow Creek, supplies finally arrived in full. New cots, new blankets, food, medical kits, hygiene products. The children ran barefoot again, not in mud, but in grass. Teresa cried when she saw the trucks roll in. "They came, Maria. They really came." Maria only smiled. They always should have. But she knew the fight wasn't over, because Rourke hadn't been held accountable publicly yet. And others, like him, still made decisions behind soundproof walls, counting on silence. That's why Maria made a new decision. With the help of a pro bono legal team, she filed a formal ethics complaint not just against General Rourke, but against the entire command structure that enabled the diversion dot. She also contacted whistleblower protection groups and began working on a framework to support other civilian employees across U.S. military bases. Her mission had grown. She wasn't just fighting for Hollow Creek now. She was fighting for every base cook, janitor, driver, and nurse who ever thought they had no power. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Maria Santiago had never stood before cameras or microphones. She never imagined she'd walk the marble halls of Washington, escorted by a Senate staffer in a navy blue blazer. She was a cook, or had been, until truth turned her into a national figure. Now, she was a key witness in a public hearing broadcast across the country. The Senate Oversight Committee chamber buzzed with anticipation as Maria stepped into the room. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder. Advocates filled the rear rows. Cameras clicked as she approached the long wooden table. Her posture was straight, but her hands trembled just beneath the surface. Across from her sat a half-circle of senators, some skeptical, others solemn, and a few already aware of the storm she'd helped unleash. She raised her right hand and took the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," she said, her voice steady. The first few questions were soft, almost procedural. How long had she worked? At Fort Bragg? What were her responsibilities? How did she come to overhear the conversation? Maria answered clearly, precisely. She explained the moment she heard General Rourke's plan to reroute aid from Hollow Creek to a construction facility in Georgia. She described the silence in the room, the steel in his voice, and the sickness in her stomach. Then came the harder questions. "Why didn't you follow the chain of command?" Maria looked up. "Because the chain was compromised. Reporting unethical orders to the person giving them isn't a solution. It's a trap." A few senators exchanged glances. One leaned in. "Are you saying the entire base command was involved?" "I'm saying the silence was too uniform to be unintentional." Then came the key moment. Senator Rayburn, a retired general himself, leaned into his mic. "Miss Santiago, you understand that leaking internal orders and private conversations carry serious implications?" Maria didn't flinch. Yes, Senator. But so does leaving children without medicine, because a deadline mattered more than their lives. The room went still. Then Senator Bell, known for her advocacy on government transparency, said, "Let the record show that Miss Santiago's courage is why we're even holding this hearing." At that moment, the chair signaled the committee clerk. A screen lit up behind Maria. They played the recording, the one from the meeting in Rourke's office. His voice rang out over the speakers. "You'll disappear from this place? Your story will rot in the same backroom where you work." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Reporters scribbled. Cameras rolled. Rourke wasn't there to defend himself. His legal counsel had advised silence. But his words now hung in the air like a noose made of ego and abuse. After the clip ended, no one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then the chair cleared his throat. "Miss Santiago, would you like to make a closing statement?" Maria stood slowly, her notes left untouched. "I'm not here because I wanted attention. I didn't do this for a medal or a headline. I did it because the system asked me to stay silent while people suffered. And I couldn't." She paused. "We always talk about service in the military. Sacrifice, duty, honor. But that service doesn't just belong to the ones in uniform. It belongs to all of us. And sometimes that means standing up when everyone else sits down." Her words landed like thunder. The hearing concluded. Applause was not protocol, but it erupted anyway. A few senators rose. Even the skeptical ones nodded in respect. Outside the chamber, Maria faced a wall of reporters. Her attorney gently tried to guide her away, but she paused for one question. "Do you feel like a hero?" A journalist asked. Maria smiled faintly. "No, I feel like someone who did what had to be done." That night, every major network replayed her testimony. Editorials called her the voice of American conscience. Social media overflowed with posts from soldiers, nurses, government workers, all thanking her for her bravery. In Hollow Creek, a community center was renamed in her honor. At Fort Bragg, the mess hall stood quiet the next morning. A framed photo of Maria had been placed above the kitchen window with one line beneath it: "Truth has no rank." And Maria? She didn't rest. She began meeting with policy advisors and military reform advocates. Whistleblower laws were being reviewed. Doors that had been locked tight were beginning to crack open. She'd spoken the truth. Now she was going to make sure it led somewhere. Because service, she knew now more than ever, wasn't about the uniform. It was about the willingness to do what's right, even when no one else will. 3 weeks after her Senate testimony, Maria Santiago stepped through the gates of Fort Bragg again, not as a suspect, not as a whistleblower under scrutiny, but as a woman who had changed the base forever. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. The buildings hadn't moved. The soldiers still marched in formation. Drills carried on. Trucks rumbled by. But eyes followed her with something new: respect. Not the kind tied to rank or ribbons, but the kind born of quiet admiration. Some saluted her, unprompted. Some just nodded, silently acknowledging what she had done. Maria didn't walk through the front doors of command. She walked back into the kitchen. Her first step onto the tiled floor felt like home and war zone at once. Her co-workers, who once feared standing too close, now greeted her like family. The head chef, who had tried to stay neutral, pulled her into a hug. "You didn't just change the base," he whispered. "You reminded us what this place is supposed to stand for." Maria tied her apron again. Same knot, same rhythm. Someone had deep cleaned her workstation. A bouquet of wildflowers sat by the spice rack. Taped to the wall was a note: "For Maria, who fed us with truth." The first meal she prepared wasn't anything fancy. Scrambled eggs, hash browns, turkey sausage. But each motion, each crack of the shell, Felt like reclaiming something she hadn't even realized she'd lost. Her peace. Mid-shift, a young private approached her at the counter, tray in hand. He looked barely out of high school. "You're her," he said awkwardly. "I watched your hearing. My mom said you reminded her of my grandmother." Maria smiled. "Is that a compliment?" He laughed. "The best kind. She raised 9 kids and still ran a bakery." He didn't ask for extra bacon, but she gave it anyway. More soldiers came by, not just for food, but to thank her. Some slipped notes into her apron. One staff sergeant, with tears in his eyes, told her he'd almost reported misconduct once, but backed out. "Next time," he said, "I won't." That afternoon, Maria stepped outside the mess hall and found herself staring at a plaque recently mounted on the wall. It read, "She didn't carry a weapon. She carried the truth." In honor of Maria Santiago, she touched it gently, then sat on the nearby bench. The Carolina sun was warm on her face. Birds chirped. The chaos had quieted, but the work wasn't done. Within days of her return, Maria began speaking with civilian contractors and low-ranking staff across the base. Custodians, cooks, medics, supply clerks, people who had long felt invisible. She listened to their fears, their frustrations. Many had seen small abuses, unethical decisions, and subtle intimidation. None had spoken up. Until now. With the help of her legal team and a group of veteran advocates, Maria launched a new initiative, Project Backbone, a support network for civilian employees working under federal or military structures who witnessed misconduct but didn't know where to turn. She arranged private meetings on weekends at the local VFW hall. She trained volunteers to educate staff about whistleblower protections. She partnered with senators pushing for new legislation to better shield civilian voices within powerful systems. The story wasn't about her anymore. It was about all the others who'd stay silent, unless someone showed them how to speak. One evening, as she was leaving the base, a black SUV pulled up beside her. The window rolled down. It was Captain Leah Monroe. "You going home?" Monroe asked, trying to. "Noticed they painted the wall in the main hall," Monroe said casually. "New quote." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Monroe smiled. "It says, 'There is no rank higher than integrity.' I think it's your fault." Maria laughed softly. "No," she replied. "I think it's finally everyone's." She looked out across the base, soldiers jogging by, officers checking clipboards, a flag flapping above the barracks, and she felt something rare, closure. She hadn't broken the system, but she had bent it, just enough for the light to shine through. And in the shadows of power, she'd reminded everyone that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it just served breakfast and told the truth. 6 months later, Maria Santiago stood in a line of honorees inside the East Room of the White House. Her hands, once burned by stovetops and worn by ladles, now held a small velvet box. Inside it was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. She barely heard her name when it was announced. The moment blurred like steam over a boiling pot. Cameras flashed, hands clapped, and yet she remained still, humbled. Her heart wasn't racing with pride, but with disbelief. Had a kitchen worker become a symbol of truth? The president spoke, voice steady and full of admiration. Maria Santiago stood when others sat. She spoke when others stayed silent. And in doing so, she reminded this nation that integrity doesn't wear a uniform. It wears courage. We honor her today not because she broke the silence, but because she broke it for others. Applause thundered through the room. Maria smiled gently, offering a respectful nod, then stepped back in line. She didn't crave spotlights. She didn't need titles. What she wanted was already unfolding far beyond the cameras. That same day, Project Backbone officially launched as a national nonprofit with satellite chapters in 5 states and military installations. Maria had poured herself into it since the hearings, creating toolkits, hosting webinars, building a hotline for civilian federal workers who felt voiceless in powerful systems. One of her first hires? A woman named Carol, a former VA nurse, who'd once been punished for reporting patient neglect. "You saved me," Carol said. "Now, I want to help someone else." That, Maria believed, was the legacy worth chasing. She returned to Fort Bragg, not as a full-time cook, though she still volunteered in the kitchen once a week, but as a consultant for ethical training programs. She designed workshops on integrity for new recruits. Officers attended to. She would always say, "You don't need stripes to do the right thing, just a spine." At the base entrance, a statue was erected near the flagpole. It didn't look like a soldier. It was a simple bronze figure of a woman in an apron, holding a ladle in one hand and a clipboard in the other. The plaque beneath read, "Maria Santiago, truth has no rank." Soldiers passed it daily. Many saluted it, even children on field trips. Asked, who was she? And their teachers would tell them, she fed more than just soldiers. She fed a movement. Despite all the recognition, Maria remained grounded. She lived in a modest home just outside Hollow Creek, next to her cousin Teresa, whose roof was finally fixed. Sometimes she'd wake early and still make pancakes for the neighborhood kids, humming to the rhythm of the frying pan. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't need to. General Rourke had been dishonorably discharged after a full military tribunal. Several of his subordinates were reprimanded. A new base commander was appointed, one who personally called Maria for her insight. Before taking post, but she never gloated. "I didn't want anyone ruined," she said during an interview. "I just wanted the system to remember the people it was supposed to serve." Years later, her story would be taught at West Point and public policy schools alike. Cadets would read it not as a tale of rebellion, but as one of conscience. And when asked how she found the strength, Maria always gave the same answer: "Doing nothing would have haunted me more than speaking up ever did." In time, she received letters from whistleblowers across the country: nurses, janitors, postal workers, clerks. They wrote of moments when they'd stood up and said no. After reading about her, she kept every letter, stacked neatly beside her kitchen counter. Because in the end, Maria Santiago never changed who she was. She didn't trade her apron for armor. She just proved you could carry both. And as she sipped tea on her porch each evening, a quiet Carolina breeze rolling in, she knew her story wasn't hers alone. Anymore. It belonged to everyone who ever doubted their voice mattered. Because sometimes the smallest voices echo the loudest. The end.